In 1876, something unprecedented happened. A young Cuban-American woman from Louisiana walked down the aisle of Grace Church in Manhattan and married the future Duke of Manchester. She carried with her a dowry worth £200,000. He carried centuries of noble lineage and a crumbling estate desperately in need of cash. That wedding opened a floodgate. Over the next 4 decades, more than 400 American heiresses would cross the Atlantic to marry European aristocrats. They brought with them fortunes built on railroads, steel, department stores, and stock speculation. By 1915, according to the publication titled Americans, 454 of these marriages had transferred over $1 billion from the New World to the Old. American heiresses had married more than a third of the House of Lords. The British called them dollar princesses. The Americans called them husband hunters. The newspapers called them the invasion. These women reshaped the British aristocracy from the inside. Their money restored crumbling palaces. Their blood now runs through the royal family. One of them raised a future prime minister. Another became the first woman to sit in parliament. A third ruled India as vicereine. And one weeping bride, forced to the altar by her own mother, would become the most famous of them all. Their stories have been largely forgotten, overshadowed by the mansions they saved and the titles they acquired. But behind every transaction was a woman. Some found misery, some found power, a few found love. This is the entire story of the forgotten Gilded Age heiresses. If you find these deep dives into history valuable, please consider subscribing and hitting the like button. Your support allows me to continue researching these stories. Let us begin with the woman who started it all. Chapter 1. The Pioneer Who Opened the Door. She was not supposed to conquer London. Maria Francisca de la Consolación Iznaga was born in 1853 to a wealthy Cuban plantation family with connections to the sugar trade. Her father, Don Antonio Modesto Iznaga del Valle, had married an American woman from Louisiana, and the family moved between Ravenswood Plantation and New York society. They were rich, they were cultured, and in the rigid hierarchy of Gilded Age America, they were outsiders. The old Knickerbocker families of New York did not welcome Cuban merchants, no matter how substantial their fortune. The Iznagas were not part of Mrs. Astor's famous 400. They lacked the pedigree that opened doors to the finest ballrooms. For ambitious families like the Iznagas, there was only one solution: look elsewhere. In the summer of 1875, at the fashionable resort of Saratoga Springs, Consuelo Iznaga encountered George Victor Drogo Montague, Viscount Mandeville. He was 23 years old, heir to the Duke of Manchester, and suffering from a lingering fever, possibly typhoid. He also possessed a reputation for gambling and reckless spending that worried his family back in England. None of that mattered to the young American woman who found herself captivated by his charm. What followed was a whirlwind courtship that alarmed parents on both sides of the Atlantic. The Duke of Manchester dispatched a friend to prevent the marriage. He failed. On May 22, 1876, Consuelo Iznaga married Viscount Mandeville at Grace Church in Manhattan. Her dowry reportedly amounted to £200,000, a fortune that would flow directly into the pockets of her gambling-obsessed new husband. This was only the second marriage of an American woman to a British peer. The newspapers crowed. Society took notice, and Consuelo Iznaga sailed for England to meet her in-laws, who received her with barely concealed hostility. The British upper classes had reason to worry. These American invaders threatened to snap up their eligible young men. The money was welcome. The women themselves were not. They were considered vulgar, ostentatious, lacking in proper breeding. They dressed too elaborately. They spoke too freely. They did not understand the unwritten rules that governed aristocratic life. Consuelo understood none of this. She did not care. What she possessed was something the English aristocracy had never encountered. She was beautiful, yes. But more than that, she was witty, vivacious, and utterly unafraid. She smoked cigars. She played the banjo. She told risque stories that shocked the more conservative members of society. And she did all of this while wearing the most dazzling gowns money could buy. The Prince of Wales noticed immediately. Albert Edward, heir to the throne and leader of the fashionable Marlborough House set, was perpetually bored by proper English ladies with their stiff manners and careful conversation. Consuelo offered something entirely different. She was fun. She was irreverent. She treated royalty with the same easy familiarity she showed everyone else. Bertie, as his friends called him, became utterly charmed. Some accounts suggest their relationship went beyond friendship. What is certain is that his acceptance of Consuelo opened every door in England that had been firmly closed to her. Once the future king declared her acceptable, no hostess in the country could refuse her. The irony was bitter. In New York, the Isnagas could not penetrate the highest circles of society. In London, Consuelo dined with royalty. Her marriage, however, was a disaster from the start. Viscount Mandeville spent her dowry on gambling and his mistress with equal enthusiasm. His father, hoping to curb the young man's excesses, exiled the couple to Tandragee Castle in Ireland, a remote and isolated property far from the temptations of London. Consuelo was miserable. In letters to friends, she described her husband's movements as erratic, his company unreliable. She learned to make plans without him. When they returned to England, the pattern continued. Mandeville spent increasing amounts of time away from home. Consuelo navigated aristocratic society alone, relying on other American women who had made similar journeys. Chief among her friends was Jenny Jerome, wife of Lord Randolph Churchill, and mother of a young boy named Winston. Financial difficulties mounted. The Manchester estates generated little income. Mandeville's gambling consumed whatever money remained. At one point, when the Prince of Wales announced he was coming to dinner, Consuelo had to ask her friends to each bring a dish because she could not afford to feed the gluttonous prince herself. Her solution was remarkable. Consuelo began offering her services to other American heiresses seeking titled husbands. For a fee, she would provide etiquette lessons, make introductions to the right people, and guide young women through the complex maze of British aristocratic protocol. She had conquered London society. Now she would help others do the same. By 1890, when Mandeville finally inherited the dukedom and Consuelo became Duchess of Manchester, the couple rarely saw each other. He died 2 years later, leaving her a widow at 39 with 3 children and an estate drowning in debt. She never returned to obscurity. Consuelo remained a fixture of London society, a favourite of the new King Edward VII, entertaining royalty and celebrities alike. She inherited $2 million from her brother in 1901, which restored her financial independence. At her death in 1909, she left an estate valued at nearly $2.5 million, along with a ruby and diamond bracelet bequeathed to her friend, Queen Alexandra. The tiara she commissioned from Cartier in 1903 now sits in the Victoria and Albert Museum. But her greatest legacy was not jewels or money. Consuelo Isnaga proved that an American woman could conquer the British aristocracy through sheer force of personality. She opened the door. Over the next 3 decades, more than 100 others would walk through it. The invasion had begun. Chapter 2. The transaction that built an empire. For the first 3/4 of the 19th century, The British landed aristocracy were the wealthiest class in the wealthiest nation on earth. Their power rested on a single foundation: land. Between 1809 and 1879, 88% of British millionaires were landowners. Their estates generated rents that funded palatial country houses, London townhouses, armies of servants, and political influence that extended from the local magistrate's bench to the highest offices in Parliament. The system had worked for centuries. Land meant wealth. Wealth meant power. Power was inherited. Then the prairies opened. In the 1870s, American farmers began cultivating millions of acres of virgin soil in Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakota Territories. They grew wheat at a cost British farmers could never match. At the same time, steamship technology transformed Atlantic shipping. Grain that once rotted in American ports could now reach Liverpool in weeks. The price of wheat collapsed. British agriculture entered a depression that would last until the Second World War. By the 1880s, Britain depended on imports for 45% of its grain. For corn specifically, that figure reached 65%. Refrigerated ships brought cheap beef from Argentina and lamb from New Zealand. Every cargo that arrived in British ports drove prices lower. Every price drop reduced what tenant farmers could pay in rent, and every reduction in rent squeezed the aristocrats who depended on that income to maintain their way of life. Oscar Wilde captured the new reality perfectly in 1895. Lady Bracknell, interrogating a potential suitor, asks about his income. When told it comes from investments rather than land, she responds with relief. Land, she declares, gives one position and prevents one from keeping it up. The joke landed because everyone in the audience understood. By the 1890s, owning a great estate had become a liability. Consider what it cost to run a country house. A modest establishment might employ 15 servants. A grand one like Longleat required 43 indoor staff alone. A house steward, butler, under-butler, groom of chambers, valet, 3 footmen, steward's room footman, 2 oddmen, 2 pantry boys, a lamp boy, housekeeper, 2 ladies' maids, nurse, nursery maid, 8 housemaids, 2 sewing maids, 2 still room maids, 6 laundry maids, chef, 2 kitchen maids, vegetable maid, scullery maid, and a daily woman. Add coachmen, grooms, stable boys, gardeners, and gamekeepers, and the wage bill alone consumed thousands of pounds annually. Then came the house itself. Heating required tons of coal. Lighting demanded endless supplies of candles and later gas or electricity. Roofs leaked, walls crumbled. Gardens needed constant attention, and aristocratic hospitality demanded entertainment on a scale that ordinary mortals could scarcely imagine. House parties lasted for days. Guests expected shooting, hunting, elaborate dinners, and accommodations befitting their station. The mathematics were brutal. Rental income was falling. Maintenance costs were rising. Staff wages increased as workers found alternative employment in factories and cities. Death duties stripped estates of capital with each passing generation. By the 1880s, land was no longer a commodity. It had become a millstone. Some aristocrats adapted. They invested in railways, mines, or urban property. They married heiresses from British manufacturing families. They economized, closing wings of their houses and reducing staff. A few sold off land or art to stay solvent. Others refused to change. They mortgaged their estates, borrowed against future income, and trusted that the depression would pass. It did not. Between 1880 and 1914, the proportion of millionaires who were landowners fell from 88% to 33%. The old aristocracy was being eclipsed by a new class of industrialists, bankers, and merchants who had no ancestral estates to maintain. For a British gentleman to work for money remained unthinkable. Trade was vulgar. Commerce was beneath them. Their entire identity rested on the assumption that they did not need to earn a living because their land provided for them. When the land stopped providing, they had few options, except one. Across the Atlantic, a new class of American millionaires had emerged from the chaos of the Civil War and the expansion of industry. Railroad barons, steel magnates, department store founders, stock speculators. They possessed fortunes that dwarfed even the wealthiest British aristocrats. They built mansions in New York and Newport that rivaled anything in England. And they had daughters. These newly rich families faced a peculiar frustration. Despite their millions, American high society remained largely closed to them. The established families of old New York guarded their drawing rooms jealously. A fortune built on railroads or retail carried a stigma that no mansion could erase. For ambitious mothers watching their daughters grow up excluded from the best parties, Europe offered an alternative. A British title carried weight that no amount of American money could replicate. A duchess outranked every hostess in Manhattan. A countess commanded respect that no railroad fortune alone could buy. And while American society might sneer at new money, it could not ignore a woman who had married into one of the oldest aristocracies in the world. The transaction was straightforward. American fathers would provide dowries substantial enough to rescue drowning estates. British aristocrats would provide titles, ancient lineages, and entry into a world where birth still mattered more than wealth. Both parties got what they wanted. Between 1870 and 1914, 102 British aristocrats married American women. 60 were eldest sons who would inherit their father's titles. 6 were dukes, the highest rank below royalty. The sums involved were staggering. Dowries ranged from tens of thousands to millions of dollars. Trust funds provided annual income for life. Marriage settlements guaranteed that American money would flow into British estates for generations. In exchange, the brides received titles, position, and the chance to live in houses that made their fathers' mansions look modest. It was an exchange of New World wealth for Old World prestige, cash for coronets, dollars for duchesses. The pattern was set. Now the ambitious mothers needed to find their prey. Chapter 3. The Woman Who Raised a Prime Minister. Leonard Jerome built his horses better stables than most New Yorkers could afford for themselves. His mansion on Madison Avenue featured a private theater seating 600 guests, a breakfast room accommodating 70, and fountains that could spray champagne during parties. Wall Street called him the King. Racing enthusiasts knew him as the father of the American turf. He co-founded the American Jockey Club, established Jerome Park Racetrack in the Bronx, and named his second daughter after the Swedish soprano Jenny Lind. The girl would grow up to be called Jenny, and she would change the course of British history. In 1867, when Jenny was 13, her mother Clara fled Leonard's serial infidelities and took the 3 Jerome sisters to Paris. They lived magnificently. When the Prussian army advanced on France in 1870, the Jeromes were among the last foreigners to escape, relocating to London. There, in the drawing rooms of Mayfair, Jenny caught the attention of the Prince of Wales. She was 19, dark-haired, with what one admirer described as more of the panther than of the woman in her look. The Cowes Regatta, in August 1873, was the social pinnacle of the British summer season. On the night of August 12th, aboard HMS Ariadne, the Prince and Princess of Wales hosted a ball honouring the heir to the Russian throne. Jenny attended in a gown of white tulle. Lord Randolph Churchill The 24-year-old third son of the Duke of Marlborough asked her to dance. By the evening's end, he was smitten. 2 nights later, in a moonlit garden overlooking the harbour, he proposed. Jenny accepted without hesitation. They had known each other 72 hours. Both families recoiled. The Duke of Marlborough considered the Jeromes vulgar American speculators. Leonard Jerome, having recently lost another fortune in the 1873 stock crash, initially supported the match, but withdrew his consent upon learning of the Duke's contempt. The young couple endured months of separation, while their fathers haggled over money like horse traders. Eventually, Jerome settled £50,000 on the couple, with the innovative stipulation that half belonged to Jenny herself, rather than passing entirely to her husband. This was radical for the era. In 1874, British married women had virtually no property rights. The wedding took place on April 15, 1874, at the British Embassy in Paris. Neither of Randolph's parents attended. His brother represented the Marlborough family. The ceremony was modest, almost secretive, with little mention in the press. 7.5 months later, on November 30th, Jenny gave birth at Blenheim Palace. She had been staying with her in-laws when she stumbled during a shooting party and was jolted further in a rough pony carriage ride. Labour began while a ball was underway elsewhere in the palace. Servants rushed Jenny to the nearest bedroom, which happened to be serving as a cloakroom for guests' coats. There, at 1:30 in the morning, she delivered a son. Lord Randolph wrote to his mother-in-law that the boy was wonderfully pretty with dark hair and eyes, and very healthy considering its prematureness. They named him Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill. Lord Randolph's political career rose with astonishing velocity. After entering Parliament in 1874 as the member for Woodstock, he became a fierce parliamentary combatant, forming the Fourth Party to challenge the Conservative establishment's staid leadership. His phrase, Tory democracy, captured imaginations. By 1886, at 37, he stood at the pinnacle of British politics, Chancellor of the Exchequer and leader of the House of Commons. Prime Minister seemed inevitable. Then he destroyed it all. Frustrated by colleagues who refused to cut military spending, he submitted his resignation to Prime Minister Lord Salisbury in December 1886, fully expecting his popularity would force Salisbury to back down. Instead, Salisbury accepted. Randolph learned his political career was over when he read the announcement in the Times. He had gambled everything on a single gesture, and lost. The decade that followed was a slow diminishment. Randolph's health deteriorated. His speech slurred. His gait became unsteady. Doctors suspected syphilis, though modern scholars have proposed a brain tumour or other neurological disease. In 1894, desperately seeking recovery, he and Jenny embarked on a world tour. They travelled with a lead-lined coffin in their luggage. By the time their ship docked back in England that December, Randolph could barely speak. He died on January 24th, 1895, 45 years old. Jenny was 40. Her husband had left debts instead of wealth, but she possessed something beyond money, a vast network of the most powerful men in Britain, and the absolute conviction that her elder son was destined for greatness. She became Winston's fiercest advocate. When the Boer War erupted in 1899, she chartered a hospital ship called the Maine, raised $150,000 to outfit it, and sailed to South Africa herself. Both her sons were serving there. Winston had already gained fame for his dramatic escape from Boer captivity. Her younger son, Jack, was wounded during the relief of Ladysmith and treated aboard her ship. Jenny nursed soldiers alongside the medical staff, treating British and Boer casualties alike. Her romantic life remained vibrant. In 1900, she married George Cornwallis West, a captain in the Scots Guards who was 16 days older than Winston. Society was scandalized. The marriage lasted 14 years before ending in divorce. In 1918, at 64, she married Montague Porch, a civil servant 3 years younger than her own eldest son. Winston reportedly quipped that he had acquired a stepfather roughly his own age. The end came suddenly. In May 1921, while visiting friends in Somerset, Jenny wore a new pair of Italian high-heeled shoes she had purchased on a recent trip to Rome. The soles had not been scored. Walking down a staircase, she slipped and fractured her ankle. Gangrene set in. Surgeons amputated her left leg above the knee on June 10th. She seemed to be recovering until June 29th, when an artery in her thigh hemorrhaged. She was 67 years old. Winston later wrote of his mother that she had shone for him like the evening star. He had loved her dearly, but at a distance. That distance was typical of upper-class British parenting in the Victorian age. Yet Jenny gave him something more valuable than daily affection, unshakable belief in his destiny and the connections to pursue it. She was buried beside Lord Randolph in the churchyard at Blaydon, near Blenheim Palace. Half a century later, her son would join them there. The Brooklyn girl who had danced at Cowes would rest forever in English soil, having launched a dynasty. Chapter 4. The Woman Who Conquered New York. Alva Smith was 6 years old when the Civil War destroyed her family's fortune. Her father had been a prosperous cotton merchant in Mobile, Alabama. By 1865, he was ruined. The Smiths fled to Paris, where Alva attended boarding school and learned to speak French like a native. She also learned something more valuable: how European aristocrats thought about power, lineage, and the uses of marriage. When the family returned to New York in the early 1870s, they had social connections, but empty pockets. Alva's mother died in 1871. Her father's finances never recovered. The Smith daughters needed to marry well or face genteel poverty. Alva chose to marry spectacularly. William Kissam Vanderbilt was the grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the ferryman who had built a railroad empire worth $100 million. William stood to inherit tens of millions. He was also handsome, amiable, and entirely manageable. They married on April 20th, 1875, at Calvary Church in Manhattan. Alva was 22 years old and had just become one of the richest women in America. Money, however, bought nothing in old New York society. The families who had ruled the city for generations, the Astors, the Schermerhorns, the Livingstons, regarded the Vanderbilts as vulgar newcomers. Alva found doors closed to her despite her husband's millions. She resolved to break them down. Her weapon was architecture. She hired Richard Morris Hunt, America's most celebrated architect, to design a French Renaissance chateau at 665th Avenue. The mansion took 4 years to build and cost $3 million. Alva supervised construction personally, appearing on scaffolding to inspect stonework, reviewing blueprints with Hunt, as though she were a professional colleague. When critics suggested such involvement was unladylike, she ignored them. The house opened in March 1883 with a costume ball that cost $250,000. 1,200 guests attended. Newspapers devoted pages to descriptions of the decorations, the costumes, the rivers of champagne. By morning, Alva Vanderbilt had achieved what money alone could never buy. Society had been forced to acknowledge her. She spent the following decade consolidating her position. In 1886, after William inherited $65 million from his father's estate, Alva commissioned the largest private yacht in the world. The Alva measured 285 feet, dwarfing even the vessels owned by families who had been yachting for generations. She sailed it through the Caribbean and Mediterranean, entertaining European aristocrats aboard. Then she turned to Newport. The Rhode Island resort was summer headquarters for America's wealthiest families. Alva hired Hunt again to build Marble House, a palace modelled on the Petit Trianon at Versailles. It cost $11 million. 36 servants staffed the property. The house stood next door to the much simpler cottage owned by the family that had once excluded her. By 1895, Alva Vanderbilt had everything she had ever wanted except a faithful husband. William's infidelities had continued throughout their marriage. Alva had tolerated them while she needed his money and name. Now she needed neither. In March 1895, she filed for divorce on grounds of adultery. Society recoiled. Divorce was social suicide for women of her class. Cast-off wives disappeared into obscurity, their reputations destroyed. Alva calculated differently. She extracted a settlement exceeding $10 million, plus Marble House and other properties outright. She retained custody of her 3 children. Most remarkably, she retained the right to remarry, a privilege courts rarely granted to divorced women. The scandal was enormous. Former friends cut her. Invitations stopped arriving. Alva had gambled her position on a single conviction, that she could rebuild from nothing, just as she had done 20 years earlier as a penniless girl from Alabama. But this time she would not rebuild alone. She had a daughter. Consuelo Vanderbilt was 18 in 1895, a celebrated beauty who had been groomed since childhood for a magnificent marriage. Alva had supervised every element of her education: languages, music, deportment, the arts of conversation and entertainment that a great hostess required. The girl had been shaped like a piece of fine porcelain, crafted specifically to ornament the highest levels of society. Now that society had rejected Alva, her daughter's marriage became more than ambition. It became necessity. A brilliant match would prove that the divorce had not diminished the Vanderbilts. It would force the families who had abandoned Alva to acknowledge her once again. And if that match involved a title, a real title, from the oldest aristocracy in Europe, it would place Alva beyond the reach of any American snob forever. She identified her candidate: Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. He was 24 years old, master of Blenheim Palace, and virtually bankrupt. His ancestors had been commanding armies when the Astors were still butchering meat. He needed money. Alva needed legitimacy. She began making arrangements. Chapter 5. The Bride Who Wept at the Altar. Winthrop Rutherford was everything Alva Vanderbilt despised. He was handsome, charming, well-bred, and entirely without a title. Society considered him the most eligible bachelor in New York. Edith Wharton later called him the prototype for the romantic heroes in her novels. He descended from Peter Stuyvesant and John Winthrop, names that meant something in old New York. But he was American. He could never make Consuelo a duchess. Consuelo did not care about titles. She was 18 years old and in love for the first time in her life. They met at parties, at dances, during the endless social rounds that consumed every season. Winthrop was 33, 15 years her senior, but the age difference seemed irrelevant when they talked. He listened to her. He asked her opinions. No one had ever asked Consuelo's opinion about anything. Her mother had made that clear years earlier, when teenage Consuelo objected to a dress. "I do the thinking. You do as you are told." In the spring of 1895, the young couple joined a group for a bicycle excursion along Riverside Drive. When the others pulled ahead, Winthrop slowed his pace. They were alone for perhaps 5 minutes. He proposed. Consuelo accepted. They agreed to keep the engagement secret until they could find a way to escape her mother's control. The next morning, Consuelo departed for Europe with Alva. Winthrop promised to follow. He would find her in Paris. They would plan their elopement. Consuelo crossed the Atlantic, believing freedom was only weeks away. She underestimated her mother completely. Alva had arranged this European tour specifically to parade Consuelo before titled aristocrats. When Winthrop arrived in Paris and presented himself at their hotel, Alva refused to admit him. She intercepted his letters before they reached Consuelo's hands. She invented slanders. Rutherford came from a family prone to madness. He could not father children. He wanted only the Vanderbilt fortune. She moved Consuelo from city to city, always staying ahead of the man pursuing them. In London, Alva arranged an introduction that would determine her daughter's fate. Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, was 24 years old and virtually bankrupt. His ancestors had commanded armies at Blenheim and Ramillies when the Vanderbilts were still Dutch farmers. He owned one of the greatest palaces in England and could not afford to heat it. He needed American money. Alva needed British prestige. Consuelo felt nothing for the Duke. She would later describe him as cold, critical, and without intellectual qualities. But Alva had not spent 18 years moulding her daughter to accept refusal now. When Consuelo was a child, Alva had strapped a steel brace to her spine during lessons, forcing perfect posture hour after hour. She had used a riding crop for discipline. The girl who emerged from that upbringing knew how to endure. She did not know how to resist. Still, she tried once. Back in Newport that August, with the Duke installed as a guest at Marble House, Consuelo confronted her mother. She announced her intention to marry Winthrop Rutherford. These words, she later wrote, were the bravest she had ever spoken. Alva exploded. She called Rutherford a fortune hunter. She threatened to shoot any man who ruined her daughter's life. The argument raged for hours. When Consuelo still refused to yield, Alva collapsed. The next morning, a family friend delivered devastating news. Alva had suffered a heart attack during the night. Her condition was grave. Another shock might kill her. Consuelo could save her mother's life by ending her engagement to Winthrop Rutherford. Consuelo broke. She sent word to Winthrop that she could not marry him. Within days, her mother made a complete recovery. The Duke proposed in the Gothic room at Marble House. Consuelo accepted because she no longer had the strength to do otherwise. The wedding took place on November 6th, 1895, at St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue. Alva orchestrated the publicity for weeks, feeding newspapers details about the gown, the jewels, the flowers sent from Blenheim. 300 policemen lined the street. Thousands of spectators pressed against barricades, straining for a glimpse of America's most famous heiress. The bride arrived 20 minutes late. Those close enough to see beneath her veil noticed her face was swollen, her eyes nearly closed. She had been weeping since dawn. A footman had stood guard outside her bedroom door that morning, preventing anyone from entering or leaving. Inside the church, the Duke waited at the altar. He had arrived late himself, reportedly after last-minute negotiations to extract additional funds. The final settlement granted him $2.5 million in railroad stock, guaranteed to produce at least $100,000 annually for life. It was the largest marriage payment in the history of Anglo-American unions. Consuelo walked toward him slowly, surrounded by bridesmaids, watched by everyone who mattered in New York society. The ceremony proceeded. Vows were exchanged. When it ended, she was Her Grace, the Duchess of Marlborough. On the honeymoon, her husband clarified the nature of their arrangement. He had not married her for love. He had married her, he said, because he felt obliged to save Blenheim. She should expect nothing more. Chapter 6. The Gilded Cage. Blenheim Palace had 300 rooms, no central heating, and no hot water in the bedrooms. From her window, Consuelo looked out over a pond in which a former butler had drowned himself. The household ran according to rules unchanged for centuries. On one of her first evenings, she asked the butler to light a fire. He looked at her with horror and sent for a footman. Lighting fires was beneath his dignity. Each servant performed specific tasks, and only those tasks. The young Duchess had committed a social error by confusing their ranks. Her mother-in-law made Consuelo's duties clear. Frances, the Dowager Duchess, interrogated her regularly about pregnancy. "Your first duty is to have a child," the old woman informed her. "And it must be a son, because it would be intolerable to have that little upstart, Winston, become Duke." Winston Churchill was the one person who made Blenheim bearable. Consuelo later described him as the life and soul of the young and brilliant circle that gathered at the palace. He talked constantly, argued passionately, and treated her as an intelligent equal. His mother had been American too. Perhaps that explained why he understood her isolation. In January 1897, Consuelo gave birth to a son, John. In May 1898, another boy, Ivor. She had provided, as she later phrased it, an heir and a spare. The expression became famous. With her obligations fulfilled, the marriage deteriorated openly. The Duke pursued Gladys Deacon. Consuelo sought her own consolations. Travel became her escape. Charity work among the estate's tenants gave her purpose. In 1906, with Winston helping negotiate terms, they formally separated. She had been Duchess of Marlborough for 11 years. The marriage was over. Consuelo was 29. Chapter 7. The Girl from Chicago Who Became Queen of India. Mary Leiter grew up surrounded by money, but not by acceptance. Her father, Levi, had arrived in America as the son of Swiss-German immigrants and worked his way from store clerk to co-founder of what would become Marshall Field and Company, the greatest department store in Chicago. By the time Mary was born in 1870, the family fortune exceeded $10 million. They owned a mansion on Wisconsin's Lake Geneva, where they moored their steam yacht, Daisy. They socialized with the Palmers and the Fields. But old Chicago society, such as it was, never quite forgot that Levi Leiter had once stood behind a counter. In 1881, the family relocated to Washington. Levi purchased the former home of James G. Blaine on DuPont Circle, a 55-room mansion that announced their arrival in the capital. Mary's mother became one of the city's leading hostesses. The young Mary, tall and slender at 5'8", debuted into Washington society and counted the First Lady, Frances Cleveland, among her closest friends. She was educated by private tutors in languages, music, and art. A Columbia professor taught her history and chemistry. She passed through finishing school in England. By 20, she was cultured, intelligent, and fluent in French. She was also lonely. Unlike Consuelo Vanderbilt, Mary Leiter suffered no controlling mother. Unlike Jenny Jerome, she felt no burning passion to conquer society. She simply wanted to find someone worthy of her devotion. The young men of Washington and New York seemed frivolous to her. The titled Europeans who pursued American heiresses seemed interested only in her father's bank account. Then she walked into a London ballroom in 1890 and saw George Curzon. He was 31 years old, 11 years her senior. He served as a member of Parliament and was heir to the barony of Scarsdale. More importantly to Mary, he was brilliant. He had written acclaimed books on Persia and Central Asia. He spoke with authority about empires and their futures. He worked himself to exhaustion, pursuing political ambitions that seemed limitless. A childhood riding accident had left him wearing a steel back brace for life, giving him an appearance of rigid formality that many found cold. Mary found it magnificent. On the day they met, she wrote to a friend, "I will have him because I believe he needs me. I have no shame." George was intrigued, but wary. American heiresses were common in London by 1890, and British aristocrats had learned to be cautious about matches that might benefit their estates but damage their reputations. He continued his travels, his political work, his endless ambitions. Mary waited. Other suitors presented themselves. She rejected them all. 3 years passed. In 1893, Mary arranged to meet George again and confessed everything. She told him it was him or no one. His response was almost everything she hoped for. He admitted he felt the same way, but he feared what his father, a conservative clergyman, would say about an American daughter-in-law. He feared what society would whisper. He needed time. Mary gave him 2 more years. They were secretly engaged in 1893, but did not marry until April 22nd, 1895, at St. John's Episcopal Church on Lafayette Square in Washington. The Leiters paid off George's considerable debts and provided a dowry of $200,000. Mary did not care about the money. She had found a man she considered worthy of absolute devotion. She gave him exactly that. When George campaigned for re-election to Parliament that autumn, observers credited his victory more to his wife's charm than to his own speeches. When he worked late into the night on policy papers, Mary sat nearby, ready to assist. When his back pain left him unable to move, she nursed him without complaint. She subordinated her own considerable intelligence entirely to his ambitions. In 1898, those ambitions reached their zenith. George Curzon was appointed Viceroy of India. The position was the most powerful in the British Empire outside London. The Viceroy ruled over 300 million people. He commanded armies, shaped policy, represented the crown in a land of Maharajas and ancient civilizations. At 39, George Curzon had achieved what he had pursued since boyhood. And Mary, at 28, became the Vicereine of India, the highest political rank ever attained by an American woman. They sailed for Bombay in December 1898. Mary wrote to her mother that they were being treated like grandees. Station masters met them at every stop. Carriages were reserved. But she had no idea what awaited her. Government House in Calcutta was a palace larger than Buckingham, staffed by hundreds of servants in scarlet and gold livery. The Curzons entertained constantly, hosting dinners for 50, balls for hundreds, receptions for thousands. Mary learned to navigate the intricate protocols of precedence that governed colonial India, where the wife of a minor official might outrank the wife of a wealthy merchant, depending on obscure rules no American could naturally understand. She also discovered suffering on a scale Washington society had never shown her. India, in 1899, was emerging from a devastating famine that had killed millions. Mary threw herself into charitable work. She championed female doctors at a time when Indian women often refused treatment from men. She established Victoria scholarships to train nurses and midwives. A hospital in Bangalore would eventually bear her name. The work exhausted her. The climate weakened her, but she refused to leave her husband's side. In 1902, George organized the Delhi Durbar, a celebration of Edward VII's coronation that became the grandest pageant in the history of the British Empire. For Mary, it would be the pinnacle of her life as vicereine. She commissioned a gown that would become legendary, but that story belongs to another chapter. Chapter 8. The Peacock Dress. The Delhi Durbar of January 1903 was designed to overwhelm. George Curzon had spent 2 years planning every detail of the celebration, marking Edward VII's coronation as Emperor of India. He wanted the world to witness British power at its most magnificent. Elephants draped in gold processed through streets lined with troops from every regiment in India. Maharajas arrived with retinues of hundreds, their turbans blazing with rubies and emeralds. A tent city covering 25 square miles housed the guests. The Times of London called it the grandest pageant in history. Mary knew her role. As vicereine, she would stand beside her husband at the centre of this spectacle. Every eye would be upon her. Every detail of her appearance would be scrutinized by Indian princes, British aristocrats, and journalists from 3 continents. She needed a gown that announced American wealth and British imperial majesty simultaneously. She turned to the House of Worth in Paris, the most celebrated dressmaker in the world. But the design would be hers. The fabric came from India itself. Mary had fallen in love with the country's textiles during her years as vicereine. She commissioned gold cloth from the weavers of Delhi, the same craftsmen who created ceremonial robes for Maharajas. Onto this shimmering surface, Indian artisans embroidered peacock feathers using a technique called zardozi, stitching with gold and silver thread wrapped around silk. The peacock was no accident. It was the symbol of royalty in India, sacred to the goddess Lakshmi, associated with immortality and divine power. By wearing peacock feathers, Mary aligned herself with Indian tradition even as she represented the British crown. But the most astonishing detail was invisible until the light caught it. Each peacock eye contained the iridescent wing case of a beetle, blue-green and shimmering like gemstones. Guests at the Durbar Ball mistook them for emeralds. The illusion was deliberate. Mary understood that fantasy mattered as much as fact in the theatre of empire. The gown weighed nearly 40 pounds. The skirt was trimmed with white roses, the bodice with antique lace. Mary wore a diamond necklace that covered her throat and a tiara with pearls tipping each of its high diamond points. When she entered the ballroom at the state reception, witnesses reported that the crowd fell silent. She moved through the hall slowly, the gold cloth catching candlelight, the beetle wings flashing blue and green, the peacock feathers rippling with each step. One observer wrote that she was the most magnificent sight at the most magnificent event the empire had ever staged. Mary had achieved what no American woman had achieved before. She had become, for one night at least, the symbolic queen of 300 million people. The Chicago merchant's daughter had outshone Maharanis, whose families had ruled for centuries. The triumph nearly killed her. The years in India had destroyed Mary's health. The relentless social obligations, the punishing climate, the constant travel through a subcontinent without modern medicine had worn her down. In 1904, she suffered a miscarriage that led to a severe infection. Doctors feared for her life. George sat by her bedside, writing down everything she murmured between periods of unconsciousness, convinced he was recording her final words. She survived, barely, but she was never strong again. George extended his term as viceroy without consulting her. Mary had begged to return to England, to rest, to recover. Instead, she found herself committed to 2 more years in a country that was slowly killing her. She went home briefly to give birth to their 3rd daughter, Alexandra, and to bury her father, who died in 1904. Then she returned to India because George needed her. In 1905, George finally resigned, following a political dispute with Lord Kitchener over military control. The Curzons sailed for England. Mary was 35 years old and looked far older. The headaches that had plagued her since girlhood now came constantly. She had lost weight she could not afford to lose. On July 18th, 1906, Mary Curzon died at their London home. She was 36 years old. George was devastated. He spent 6 years building a memorial chapel at Kedleston Hall, their family estate, commissioning a marble effigy of his wife that he instructed should express the pathos of her premature death and his deepest emotion. The inscription he composed read, "Perfect in love and loveliness." Beauty was the least of her rare gifts. God had endued with like graces her mind and soul. She was mourned in 3 continents. The peacock dress survived. It hangs today at Kedleston Hall, preserved behind glass, the beetle wings still shimmering after more than a century. Visitors stand before it and try to imagine the woman who wore it, the Chicago girl who became Queen of India, who gave everything she had to a husband and an empire, and died before she reached middle age. Mary Leiter Curzon achieved the highest rank of any American woman in the age of dollar princesses. She paid for it with her life. Chapter 9. The Suffragette's Confession. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont had reinvented herself before. The cotton merchant's daughter had become a Vanderbilt. The divorced woman had survived social death. Now, in 1908, she would transform once more. Oliver Hazard, Perry Belmont, died in June of that year. Alva had married him in 1896, barely a year after her scandalous divorce from William Vanderbilt. Society had expected her to disappear into obscurity. Instead, she had moved into Belcourt Castle, Oliver's Newport mansion filled with medieval armor and horses stabled on the ground floor, and continued entertaining as though nothing had happened. Oliver adored her. Their 12 years together were, by all accounts, genuinely happy. His death left her wealthy, widowed, and searching for purpose. She was 55 years old. Her daughter Consuelo was trapped in a miserable marriage at Blenheim. Her sons had their own lives. The social battles that had consumed her youth now seemed trivial. She needed a cause worthy of her ferocious energy. She found it in votes for women. The suffrage movement had existed for decades, but by 1908 it remained a fringe concern in America. Respectable women did not march in streets. They did not give speeches on soapboxes. They certainly did not challenge the fundamental structure of society that kept them dependent on fathers and husbands. Alva had spent her entire life mastering that structure. Now she proposed to tear it down. Her conversion was sudden and total. Within months of Oliver's death, she had joined the National American Woman's Suffrage Association. Within a year, she had founded her own organization, the Political Equality Association, designed to bring suffrage advocacy into every neighborhood of New York City. She opened her mansions for rallies. She funded newspapers and pamphlets. She marched at the head of parades down Fifth Avenue, the same street where she had once arrived in triumph at her costume ball. The woman who had forced her daughter into a loveless marriage now argued that women must be freed from male control. Some saw hypocrisy. Alva saw evolution. She had played by society's rules and won everything those rules offered. She had also watched her daughter weep at the altar and spend a decade in misery at Blenheim. She had seen what happened when women had no choices. The system she had mastered was the same system that had crushed Consuelo. In 1909, Alva told a reporter, "I have been repenting ever since." Her methods had not changed, only her targets. She approached suffrage the same way she had approached conquering Mrs. Astor, with unlimited money, relentless determination, and absolute refusal to accept defeat. She rented a floor of a Fifth Avenue building for campaign headquarters. She commissioned a Chinese tea house at Marble House specifically for suffrage meetings. She befriended the militant British suffragettes and brought their tactics to America. In 1912, she led a division of New York's massive suffrage parade, thousands of women marching through streets lined with jeering men. In 1913, she helped organize a march in Washington, timed to coincide with Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, drawing national attention to the cause. In 1917, she was among the founders of the National Woman's Party and helped organize the first pickets ever staged outside the White House. The newspapers that had once covered her balls now covered her arrests. Through it all, she maintained contact with Consuelo. The separation of 1906 had freed her daughter from daily life at Blenheim, but the marriage remained legally intact. The Duke wanted an annulment so he could convert to Catholicism and remarry. Consuelo wanted freedom. Alva wanted redemption. In 1926, the case came before a Catholic tribunal in England. Canon law permitted annulment only if the original marriage had been invalid, typically because one party had been coerced. Investigators needed testimony about what had happened in 1895. Alva provided it. She appeared before the tribunal and stated plainly what she had never publicly admitted. "I forced my daughter to marry the Duke. I have always had absolute power over my daughter." She described the threats, the manipulation, the fake illness that had broken Consuelo's resistance. She held nothing back. The words were a confession and an apology delivered 31 years too late. They were also a legal instrument that gave Consuelo her freedom. The annulment was granted on August 19, 1926. Consuelo was finally officially no longer the Duchess of Marlborough. Mother and daughter reconciled. In her final years, Alva lived mostly in France, where Consuelo had settled with her second husband, the French aviator Jacques Balsan. The relationship between them softened into something approaching friendship. They had both survived. They had both, in their different ways, found freedom. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont died in Paris on January 26, 1933. She was 79 years old. The 19th Amendment, guaranteeing American women the right to vote, had passed 13 years earlier. She had lived to see her cause triumph. At her funeral, the suffragists she had funded and fought beside filled the church. They remembered not the society hostess or the controlling mother, but the woman who had spent her final decades demanding that women be treated as full citizens. Her tombstone, by her instruction, bore no mention of the Vanderbilts or the Belmonts. It identified her simply as a leader in the fight for women's rights. The mother who had arranged everything had finally arranged her own redemption. Chapter 10. The Virginia Girl Who Made History. Nancy Langhorne was not supposed to conquer anything. She was born in 1879 in Danville, Virginia, the 8th of 11 children in a family that had lost everything in the Civil War. Her father, Chiswell, had been a Confederate officer. After the surrender, he struggled for years before rebuilding the family fortune through tobacco auctions and railroad construction. By the time Nancy was a teenager, the Langhornes had money again, but they remained Southerners in a South still defined by defeat. She was beautiful, sharp-tongued, and utterly unmanageable. At 17, she eloped with Robert Gould Shaw II, a Boston socialite whose family had produced Civil War heroes. The marriage was a disaster. Shaw drank heavily. He was violent. Nancy fled back to Virginia with their infant son and obtained a divorce in 1903, a scandal that should have ended her prospects in respectable society. Instead, she sailed for England. Her sister Irene had married the artist Charles Dana Gibson, whose illustrations of elegant American women had made the Gibson girl the ideal of feminine beauty. Nancy, with her delicate features and quick wit, could have modelled for any of them. She arrived in London in 1905 and immediately attracted attention. The Prince of Wales noticed her at a party. Hostesses competed to invite her. She had that American quality that the British found simultaneously refreshing and unsettling. She said exactly what she thought. At a hunting party in 1906, she met Waldorf Astor. He was the son of William Waldorf Astor, an American millionaire who had renounced his citizenship and moved to England after failing to achieve the social prominence he craved in New York. The elder Astor had purchased Cliveden, one of the great estates of England, and a newspaper empire that gave him political influence. He had also purchased a peerage, becoming Viscount Astor in 1917. Waldorf, quiet and serious, where Nancy was volatile and vivid, fell in love immediately. They married in 1906. Nancy became mistress of Cliveden, a palace overlooking the Thames that had hosted every important figure in British politics for generations. She also became, by degrees, one of the most influential hostesses in England. The Cliveden set, as her circle came to be known, included politicians, writers, intellectuals, and aristocrats who gathered for weekends of conversation that shaped policy. But Nancy wanted more than influence. She wanted power. When Waldorf's father died in 1919, Waldorf inherited the viscountcy and was forced to leave his seat in the House of Commons. Peers could not serve in the lower house. The constituency of Plymouth Sutton needed a new candidate. Nancy announced she would stand for election. No woman had ever sat in the British Parliament. The Representation of the People Act of 1918 had granted women over 30 the right to vote and the right to stand for office, but no woman had yet won a seat. Constance Markievicz had been elected in 1918, but refused to take her place because she was an Irish Republican who rejected British rule. The first woman to actually sit in Parliament would be whoever won the next available election. Nancy campaigned as only Nancy could. She knocked on doors in working-class neighbourhoods, bantering with housewives and dock workers in language that shocked her handlers. When hecklers interrupted her speeches, she interrupted them back. One man shouted that she was too rich to understand ordinary people. She replied that she had been poor once and found it overrated. Another asked what she would do about drink. She announced she was a teetotaler who would support temperance, then added that she understood why men drank. Their wives probably drove them to it. On November 28, 1919, she won Plymouth Sutton with a majority of more than 5,000 votes. On December 1st, Nancy Astor took her seat in the House of Commons. She wore a simple black outfit with a white blouse, the same colours that suffragettes had worn in their marches. The men who filled the chamber had no idea what to do with her. Neither did she, entirely. But she sat down, the first woman to do so in 700 years of parliamentary history, and refused to leave. She would remain in Parliament for 26 years. She championed women's rights, children's welfare, and temperance. She was fearless, frequently outrageous, and impossible to ignore. Winston Churchill, who detested her politics, reportedly told her that if she were his wife, he would drink poison. She replied that if she were his wife, she would give it to him. The Virginia girl who had fled a violent marriage and sailed to England with nothing but her wit had become the first woman to sit in the most powerful legislative body in the world. She had not married her way to power. She had won it. Chapter 11. The Great-Grandmother of a Princess. Frances Work wanted nothing to do with the British aristocracy. Her father had made that abundantly clear. Frank Work was a Wall Street stockbroker who had amassed a fortune trading alongside Cornelius Vanderbilt and Jay Gould. He was also a fierce American patriot who despised the practice of selling American daughters to European nobles. When his own daughter, Frances, announced her intention to marry James Burke Roche, heir to an Irish barony, Frank threatened to disinherit her. Frances married him anyway. The wedding took place at Christ Church in New York in September 1880. Frances was 19 years old and believed herself in love. James was charming, handsome, and would one day become the third Baron Fermoy. He was also, as Frances would discover, a gambler and a philanderer who had pursued her primarily for her father's money. The marriage collapsed within a decade. James burned through Frances's allowance at the gaming tables of London and Monte Carlo. He kept mistresses openly. When Frances fled back to America with their twin sons, Maurice and Francis, and their daughter Cynthia, she had nothing left but her pride and her father's grudging support. Frank Work imposed conditions for his forgiveness. Frances must divorce Roche. The children must be raised as Americans. They must renounce any claim to British titles, and they must never return to England. Frances agreed to everything. In 1891, she obtained her divorce on grounds of adultery and settled back into New York society as a cautionary tale about the dangers of marrying foreign aristocrats. Then Frank Work died in 1911, and everything changed. His will contained the conditions he had imposed in life. Any grandchild who returned to England or assumed a British title would be disinherited. But Francis's son, Maurice, had spent his childhood dreaming of the barony he had been forced to renounce. He was more Irish than American, more drawn to the old world than the new. Within months of his grandfather's death, he sailed for England. Maurice Burke Roche became the fourth Baron Fermoy in 1920 when his father James finally died. He settled in Norfolk, where he became a close friend of King George V through their shared passion for shooting. He married an Anglo-Scottish heiress named Ruth Gill, a society beauty who would become a lady-in-waiting to the Queen Mother. Together they had 3 children. The youngest was a girl named Frances, named after the grandmother who had fled England 40 years earlier. Frances Roche grew up in the shadow of Sandringham, the royal estate in Norfolk. Her family moved in the highest circles of British society. In 1954, she married Viscount Althorp, heir to the Spencer earldom, at Westminster Abbey with the Queen and Queen Mother in attendance. It was considered one of the great society weddings of the decade. The marriage produced 5 children. The fourth, born in 1961, was a girl they named Diana. Diana Spencer grew up at Park House on the Sandringham estate, quite literally next door to royalty. Her grandmother, Ruth, the former lady-in-waiting, remained close to the Queen Mother and ensured that Diana moved in royal circles from childhood. When Diana was 16, she met Prince Charles at a shooting party. When she was 19, he proposed. On July 29, 1981, Diana Frances Spencer married the Prince of Wales at St. Paul's Cathedral before a global television audience of 750 million people. She became the most famous woman in the world, the great-granddaughter of Francis Work, the American heiress who had fled her disastrous marriage to an Irish baron, had become the Princess of Wales. The bloodline that Frank Work had tried so desperately to keep American had produced a future Queen of England. Frank Work's fortune, what remained of it, passed to descendants who had violated every condition of his will. His great-great-grandson, William, Diana's son, will one day sit on the British throne. The American stockbroker who despised European aristocracy became the ancestor of kings. Frances Work herself remarried in 1919, wedding a French-Romanian horsebreeder named Aurel Batogny. She lived quietly in New York until her death in 1947, by which point her grandson Maurice was an established figure in British society, and her great-granddaughter Frances was being groomed for the aristocratic marriage market. She never met Diana, She never knew that her flight from England and her father's furious conditions would become a footnote in the biography of the most celebrated princess of the 20th century. The dollar princess who escaped had produced a legacy she never intended: the billion-dollar invasion. Between 1870 and 1914, 454 American women married into the British aristocracy. They carried with them dowries totaling more than $1 billion. They saved crumbling estates, funded political careers, and produced heirs who would shape the 20th century. One of their descendants sits on the British throne today. They called it the Dollar Princess Invasion, and it changed two nations forever. The women in this story arrived in England as outsiders. Consuelo Iznaga came from a Cuban-American family that old New York society considered exotic at best. Jenny Jerome was the daughter of a stock speculator who built racetracks. Mary Leiter's father had once stood behind a department store counter. Alva Smith grew up in poverty after the Civil War destroyed her family. Frances Work married against her father's explicit wishes and fled her disastrous union within a decade. Nancy Langhorne escaped a violent first husband before finding her way to Cliveden. None of them were born to greatness. All of them seized it. The exchange was supposed to be simple: American money for British titles, New World fortunes for Old World prestige. The daughters of railroad barons and retail magnates would become duchesses and countesses. Their fathers would pay off mortgages and repair roofs. Everyone would benefit. Reality proved more complicated. Consuelo Vanderbilt wept at her wedding and spent a decade in a loveless marriage before escaping to build a life of her own. Mary Curzon gave everything to her husband's ambitions and died at 36, worn out by the demands of empire. Jenny Jerome watched her brilliant husband descend into madness and death, then reinvented herself as a magazine editor, playwright, and hospital ship organizer. Alva Vanderbilt forced her daughter into misery, then spent her final decades fighting for women's right to choose their own destinies. The pattern held across hundreds of marriages. Some found genuine happiness. Helena Zimmerman, who married the Duke of Manchester in 1900, enjoyed a companionate partnership that lasted until her husband's death. Consuelo Vanderbilt eventually found love with Jacques Balsan, the French aviator who had admired her since she was 17. Many others endured decades of unhappiness, trapped by social expectations and legal systems that offered women few exits. What united them was transformation. These women did not simply accept the roles assigned to them. They bent those roles, broke them, or escaped them entirely. Mary Curzon became the most powerful American woman of her era and used that power to champion women's healthcare across India. Nancy Astor won election to Parliament and spent 26 years demanding that men share power with women. Alva Belmont converted from society hostess to suffragette general, funding the movement that won American women the vote. Even Consuelo Vanderbilt, who had been given no choices as a girl, eventually chose her own path, divorcing her duke and marrying for love. They also left behind something unexpected: a legacy of transformation in British society itself. The American heiresses brought more than money. They brought informality, energy, and a refusal to accept that birth determined worth. They hosted parties where artists mingled with aristocrats. They supported causes that horrified their conservative in-laws. They raised children who would question the rigid hierarchies their grandparents had taken for granted. By the time the First World War shattered the old order, the British aristocracy had already begun to change from within. American blood flowed through dozens of great families. American ideas had infiltrated drawing rooms and dinner parties. The women who had arrived as purchased brides had become agents of cultural transformation. Today, tourists walk through Blenheim Palace without knowing that American railroad money saved it from ruin. They admire the peacock dress at Kedleston Hall without understanding that a Chicago merchant's daughter wore it before 300 million colonial subjects. They watch The Crown and Downton Abbey, fascinated by a world that American heiresses helped create and ultimately helped destroy. Prince William, who will one day be king, carries the bloodline of Frances Work, the dollar princess who tried to escape. His grandmother Diana became the most famous woman in the world, partly because she embodied something the British public had always loved about the American arrivals: a freshness, a vulnerability, a refusal to simply perform the role assigned to her. The invasion ended more than a century ago. The fortunes have been spent. The estates have become museums and hotels. But the transformation those women set in motion continues. They came for titles. They stayed to change history.